Okay, thanks, Todd. So what I'm going to discuss tonight is about special delivery, but I want to look at it from the perspective of how it came about and what makes it so special. So when you think about this period of time from 1787 to 1914, people that study communication theory or information theory call it the long century, and the reason they call it the long century is because it was a period of time between the signing of the Constitution and the outbreak of World War II that the United States completely transformed from an agrarian economy to a world powerhouse. And what's interesting is during this period of time, the long century, if you will, the information environment, underwent such a transformative change that it really changed America, obviously, and there's nothing earth-shattering in that statement. But what's really important is that the United States Post Office Department was front and center in many of these changes, technologically, philosophically, and politically. So I want to describe that a little bit and then get into the actual philatelic side of special delivery. So when you look at the information environment, it's defined by these characteristics. How much time does it take for something to go from point A to point B? What does it cost? Is it done reliably? And access can mean two things. One, access meaning, is the entire population have access to this service? And also, is the service being provided, is it able to access all participants? So you have to keep this in mind as you think about the evolution of special delivery. How do all of these factors sort of culminate in the launching of the special delivery service? Which happened in 1885. And what happened is through a culmination of a number of situations and circumstances, it all sort of came together and was able to launch the special delivery service, which I'll talk about. And again, as everything changes over time, the information environment evolved in the 2000, up to 1997, if you will, the 1900s, and eventually special delivery becomes obsolete and disappears. And so we will talk a little about why that happened. So when you look at the colonial period to about the early 1800s, and if you take into account these factors, again, time, cost, access, and reliability, the methods by which information was transmitted was by ships, by post riders. Obviously, for us that live in the Boston area, understand the Boston Post Road and its history. The organization of the communication occurred through the charters that the Colonial Post Office established and the Post Office Department. And what's interesting is the speed could be months, weeks, several days. So the notion of time becomes a factor, but you weren't going to pay extra money for that, for example. So in the colonial period, the Colonial Post Office was chartered in 1691 and, was established by the Crown. What's interesting, Benjamin Franklin becomes the postmaster, the colonial postmaster in 1735, and quickly kicks off a newspaper right in 1758. And what's really interesting about that is what that newspaper rate did is it encouraged journalism, and it also helped the printing and journalism take off in the United States or the colonial states at the time. Post roads existed, as I mentioned. What's interesting, the amount of time it took for mail to travel from Boston to England or for a letter to go from Boston to Georgia took about the same amount of time. So again, the notion of time was kind of spread out. In 1764, when the Albany Convention occurred, which was the first time the colonies got together to discuss, their common grievances with England, the Committee of Correspondence is kicked off, and that was a letter writing mechanism between the colonies to stay in touch with each other. So I think it's important to note that the notion of communicating was, in the colonial period, right from the get-go. Now, after the Revolutionary War in 1787, when the post office is established, it doesn't get codified into a set of practices and principles until the Postal Office Act of 1792. A couple key points is that mail is considered, the sanctity of the mail was important, meaning it was private, the government couldn't open it, and it was key that it would have access for all. So again, this notion of access, the goal was to provide mail service, if you will, to every citizen. Newspaper rates continued, and those newspaper rates were a fraction of what it cost to send a letter. And as a consequence of that, it's believed, scholars look at this, that the literacy of the early Americas was helped quite a bit by the fact that newspapers were available. The post office was, in fact, a monopoly. It was under the, all mail was under the control of the post office, and that comes into play in many factors. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then finally, the post office expanded exponentially during this period. And again, newspaper volume made up about 50% of all mail volume. And again, it was a key contributor to the literacy of Americans. Now, here's an example of a letter that was sent in 1768 from New York to Lebanon, Connecticut. Again, what's interesting about it is the sender says, with the utmost importance, as this is a letter of, with utmost speed, as this is a letter of importance. So again, the notion of getting information conveyed as quickly as possible within the constraints of time, cost, access, and reliability have always been in people's minds that, I have something important to say and I want to get it communicated as fast as I possibly can to the receiver. Now, as we move into the antebellum period, just prior to the Civil War, I'll talk about the methods of communication in a little bit more detail in the next build here. But again, the organization of the Postal Service, the post office is under the U.S. Post Office Department. But what's also interesting, during this period, there was the emergence of private mail services, and they have a profound economic impact on the post office and on mail delivery in the United States in general. And now the time in which it takes to deliver the mail, primarily letters, shrinks to weeks, to days, in some cases within a day. So just to kind of pick up on what's going on as far as methods of communication, the Post Office Department said that any road, canal, or waterway would be considered a post road, and therefore the U.S. Congress had some level of control over the definition of what it was and how it would get funded. Another very important point is the post office controlled stagecoach mail, as this replaced postal riders, meaning that there was a much more organized mechanism by which mail could be delivered by stagecoach. Obviously, the volume could go up tremendously because of the ability to carry it, and it really became a very important element of mail delivery in the early 1800s. And during this time was the emergence of the railroads as well. Now, as I mentioned, independent mail carriers or private mail carriers became very important, or became prevalent, in the 1840s and the 1850s. And these emerged because they took advantage of the high U.S. postal rates. If you're familiar with the postal system, prior to 1847, that the rates were difficult to understand. Mail was delivered on due, etc. So these independent mail carriers took advantage of a lot of these inefficiencies in the post office to create an independent mail system, which, in fact, reflects a lot of what we have today. And in many cases, their delivery was faster, it was trusted, it was at a lower cost, and it meets a lot of these information environment attributes that were mentioned a little while ago. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Post Office Department was a monopoly, and there was ongoing litigation with these independent mail carriers during this time to try to shut them down, even though they were incredibly efficient. Now what happened is the Postal Reform Act of 1845 standardized rates, which became very important in simplifying the mail. Letters became prepaid, so the notion of having to worry about delivery and collecting the fee at the end was basically mitigated. And obviously, this led to the creation of our, the postage stamps as we know today with the issue of 1847. But what's insightful, though, is many people would say, the Postal Reform Act of 1845 was as a result of the British Postal Reform Act in 1840. While it was a good model, what really motivated the Congress and what really motivated the post office to proceed with this Postal Reform Act was to cripple the private carriers and to protect the monopoly, because there was about 50% of the mail being transported. Again, this is what many scholars believe during this period. And it had a profound impact on the financial situation within the post office. And as a consequence, they decided that one of the ways in which to sort of break the private carriers was to litigate. And in fact, they did. But the consequences longer term was that the postal rates were lower. there was broader public use because now they had more access to it in an understandable way with postal rates that made sense. And because of a lot of these changes, it drove reform within the post office and reliability increased. So now you have all these factors: reliability, access to people, costs going down, and reduced time, all coming into play. Now, here's an example of a cover that was mailed in 1844 from Cleveland to Connecticut. And in fact, you'll notice it has on it three stamps from, it has stamps from three different private mail carriers. And again, this is 1844, so this predates the Postal Act, this predates US stamps. And in fact, you'll notice that, postage stamps were used as a prepaid way of sending letters, and just so happened that this letter made its way from Cleveland to New Haven through the hands of three very specific private mail carriers. Now, when you get into the Civil War and to the 1880s, again, the information environment changes dramatically. The railroad system matures. And again, an overarching, consequence here, obviously, is that the U.S. Civil War happening, accelerates so much technology, communication, armaments. There was changes in society, all the things that, historians discuss. But when you look at it from a mail perspective, the emergence of the rail becomes critical. Local delivery, we'll talk about that in a minute. And the organization of the post office really reaches, all aspects of the continental United States. And in many cases, letters can now be conveyed in less than a day, while obviously letters from, across the continent or significant differences still take a certain amount of time. Now, what's really an interesting social phenomenon is because of the Civil War, the post office department was unburdened by the costly needs of the rural South during this period. And as a consequence of that, the Postmaster General Montgomery Blair under Abraham Lincoln is able to make some significant changes in the post office, and therefore the consequences on the mail system in general, again, increasing a number of the attributes when it comes to a better information environment. The first one is he's able to initiate free city delivery. So instead of having to go to the post office to pick up your mail, there's now regular mail delivery to private residences and businesses in large cities. Again, this is a access benefit that the public gets and now expects it going forward. And because there was a consolidated usage of the railroad system, which prior to the Civil War, the post office department had a very difficult time because of cost because of cost reasons, as well as some of the economic conditions in which the rail systems operated, that the postal system was unable to reach contracts with many railroads to organize a railroad postal system. But in 1869, the railway mail service comes into being, and it really solidifies the rail system as a way to deliver mail. And as Todd has, for example, in his background, he has an example of a railway post office. The ability to sort mail in line while the mail is traveling from point to point. Additionally, Montgomery Blair was also able to make some social changes, such as hiring African Americans into the postal system. Now, the stamp that you see there commemorates Blair, who he led the United States into an international conference, which eventually becomes the UPU. Now, on the private side, the hundreds of package delivery companies flourished during the Civil War, and they continued for many years prior to, during, and after the Civil War. And in fact, Wells Fargo still exists today as a bank. Adams Express still exists today as a financial institution. But these organizations found a way in which they could add value by delivering primarily packages during the Civil War. Now, what's a very good example is the U.S. Express Company that was founded in 1860 really found a more efficient way to leverage packages through delivery using the railroads. And again, these methodologies become adopted by the Postal Service over time, making it much more efficient, and obviously, helps it better its delivery practices within the railway mail service. Now, here, one thing is a lot of people would say, oh, well, the telegraph existed then, that just takes care of everything. Well, as we all know, different technologies have different adoption rates, have different access capabilities, have different cost structures. So while the telegraph becomes, prominent primarily in business, it has limited access to average Americans and certainly to even businesses. So it's there, but it's naive to think that alone could have met the needs of the country. Now, here's an example of a cover from 1882, and this was a kind of a phenomenon that companies like Wells Fargo made use of primarily. Is the Postal Service basically made it illegal for private carriers to deliver mail along an existing postal route. So what companies like Wells Fargo did is they bought embossed envelopes in the post office department, added their own franking to it, and then you paid to have the mail delivered from point A to point B. So it was an incremental cost, but in terms of time and reliability, that went way up. And here's an example where Wells bought an embossed envelope for 3 cents, affixed their franking to it. This particular letter was delivered from the Arizona Territory to San Francisco. The post office department was paid, Wells was paid, and the customer is happy. Now, with all of this going on as sort of a lead-in, how does special delivery come about? Well, during this period, the 1860s and 70s, primarily going into the 1870s, there's a lot of public demand for a faster mail service delivery, and many people were advocating for it. Now, I just happen to live on Cape Cod, so I thought this was interesting that this gentleman, Joseph Story Fay, who was at Woods Hole working, he advocated a letter to Congress in 1870. And what's odd about this letter is cited for the next 10 years or so as the special delivery service is defined and put into implementation. But the real driver for the creation of special delivery in terms of how it worked was Frank Hatton, who was a postmaster general in the Arthur administration. He was an astute business person that understood that there was a clear market and need for a faster, more reliable mail service that a fee could be charged for. But he also knew that he had to develop this in order to continue to stamp down competitive pressures for other mail systems. So he really drove and advocated for special delivery, working closely with Charles Skinner, a congressman from New York, who basically drove a congressional appropriations process for special delivery, not making the appropriations available in 1883, but they came about in 1884. And this defined the launch of the special delivery service in an act I'll talk about in a moment. So it was ironic, though, that, if you're familiar with the politics in the United States in the 1800s, not that it's not true today, but certainly in this period, there was a lot of patronage that went on with important roles within the government. And the post office department was probably one of the largest just because of the sheer number of patronage jobs that could be doled out to various political associations. So ironically, when the Cleveland administration, which was Democratic, came into power, if you will, the Arthur administration being Republican, Hatton was replaced by William Vilas, and the Special Delivery Services Bill passed into law on March 3rd, 1885, right around the inauguration of Cleveland, just as Hatton was on his way out the door. So this service comes into being. He marshaled it through, but it's administered under his successors. Now, how does it work? The Special Delivery Services Act, or the Immediate Delivery Service, which it was also known as, commenced on October 1st, 1885. Now, initially, it was limited to first-class mail and postal cards, and letters could be sent from any post office, but only to 555 identified what we'll call special delivery post office, meaning post office that were large enough to be able to provide, same-day delivery in large communities that had at least 4,000 residents. So this is the initial invocation of it. And, here's a piece of ephemera, if you will, from the time where Remington Typewriter Company put together a booklet that listed all these 555 special delivery offices. And what it looked like is, it had a list of post office and where they were. Again, I live on the Cape. And so Plymouth, Massachusetts was the closest one to the Cape. And since, where I live is outside the range of Plymouth, we wouldn't be able to receive special delivery service in 1885 when it first was launched. Now, what's real important to note here is that the letters could be sent from any post office and it was into the established mail stream. So letters would travel like a normal letter would until it arrived at the special delivery post office. And at that point, the special delivery service would commence. Another interesting aspect is that the fee for special delivery was a 10 cents additional fee on top of the postal rate of the time for first class mail, which was 2 cents. So for 5x the cost of mailing a letter, you could send a letter special delivery. Another interesting aspect of this is that a special delivery stamp was created, and this stamp was actually defined within the Special Delivery Services Bill. So it's hard to imagine, Congress in a bill defining the details of special delivery to this extent, meaning that they were defining the stamp itself, meaning its size. Its size was unusual. It was twice the size of existing stamps, which we come to know as the commemorative size. They also defined what would be on the stamp, a messenger delivering the mail. So that was all defined within that bill, ironically. What happened was special delivery items, upon receipt within the receiving post office, would be dispatched immediately. This is from the bill by a special messenger. And this particular cover that you see here, I wish I owned it, but I don't, is one of the 4 or 5 surviving first day of use covers of special delivery, this one being from New York. Now, what happened was when the letter arrived at the receiving post office in this example, they were supposed to affix to it a receiving stamp that basically said it was received at this particular post office. Here's a blow up of that. The messenger would affix his number to it, the date and the time in which it arrived. So it would come into the delivering office, and now it has to be quickly delivered. And the hours of operation was 7 to midnight, 6 days a week. And there's some statistics that, defined it as a success, that the average delivery time from the time the letter was received was about 17 minutes in the first month of operation. And that the net income, if you will, the profit from this was, as you see there, 28. But, it's about $100,000 in current currency. Now, who were these special delivery messengers? Now, special delivery messengers were young boys who were hired on not as full-time employees, but if you will, as contractors, and they were expected to, go about delivering these special delivery letters. And the postal regulations of 1893, as you can read there, identify some of the attributes. As we all know, hiring a young boy around 13 years of age or as a young teenager would probably not pass muster today with, child labor laws and the like. But in that point in time, this was a way in which people were able to make somewhat of a living. As you can see there, they can make up to $30 a month. Something that's really important that, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but a tremendous bureaucracy, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but a lot of infrastructure, regulations and adherence to regulations had to be put in place in order to make special delivery work. And that's another attribute of communication systems. They have to have protocols and procedures to make them work. And special delivery is a great example of all of that. And again, each of the messengers had a set of protocols that they were expected to follow. So what I do now for the remainder of the time is just do an overview of special delivery postage and some of its characteristics. So the first special delivery stamp, E1, was defined in support of delivery to these 555 special delivery post offices. And so if you look at the stamp itself, you'll notice it says right on the stamp, at special delivery office. So E1, codified the fact that if you use special delivery, it was only could be sent to one of these 555 offices, therefore for delivery from that point forward. Again, this was the first US stamp to use the commemorative or double wide format. And what's goes down in the folklore, and I'll talk about some references at the end. But the designer of the stamp, Charles Morse, had a model for the running messenger boy, a young man named Fred Pauling. And as the story goes, he had him pose in this running position for so many hours that he allegedly passed out from all of that modeling, if you will. Again, it could be just a story, but I found it interesting. It's written up in a variety of sources. Now, here's an example of E1 in action, so to speak. This was sent a few days after special delivery started. I chose this one. I own this cover in this letter. Well, I think it's interesting because here you go. It came special delivery. It came quickly, and basically how the letter starts out, it says, "Don't be alarmed at seeing this special delivery stamp." So again, the notion of how important it was to be delivered was expressed right in the first line of the letter. And quite frankly, what the writer is doing is offering this up as a way of the person accepting the letter as a commemorative, if you will, of special delivery. Now, here's just another example. This is interesting. I don't own this cover, wish I did. But here's an example of special delivery stamp being used, where it was delivered to a business in Boston, who then turned around and on the same day sent it and remailed it to somebody in Cambridge. So you can see the 2-cent franking along with special delivery stamps on this cover, just as an interesting example. Now, E2 came into being as a consequence of the Postal Act of 1886, which extended the definition of special delivery. It was considered such a success that it was extended to the other classes, second, third, and fourth class. And now special delivery services would be available at all post offices in the United States. So what had to happen is that the stamp had to change to say at any post office. And that's the primary difference between E1 and E2. In fact, E1 was used for at least another year or two after the Postal Act of 1886, because they had the inventory that needed to be used up. And again, you can see, but from its issue date to when the Postal Act was put into effect, that is a couple of years. Now, again, when a letter was received at a post office, a marking would be put on it. The messenger would put his number, the time the time and the date at which the letter arrived, basically acknowledging that it had arrived, and this will become important in a minute, had acknowledged that it arrived and that it would then turn around and be delivered. Now, it's interesting what happened is, as you could imagine, again, coming back to some of the regulations and bureaucracy around special delivery, a letter could go to a business, let's say, but what if nobody's there to receive the letter? So what would happen is that it would be stamped with this stamp that I just highlighted that says it was offered at that address at a particular day and time, and the reason it wasn't delivered, in this case, the office was closed. You could see it was delivered at 7:55 p.m., which might seem like after hours, but again, the hours of special delivery ran, outside of the more traditional business day, if you will. Now, what happened was that there was some confusion about what would happen to special delivery mail if it wasn't delivered. So the city of New York, the New York Post Office, had quite an elaborate printing capability. So what they did was they created this notice that was affixed to the back of special delivery letters, explaining that if it wasn't delivered when the first opportunity arose to bring it to the receiver, it would then be treated as ordinary mail from that point forward, meaning returned to the post office and then put out in the normal mail stream. So this notification became pretty standard because, again, it was important for people to understand the consequences of a delayed delivery. Now, the next stamp, E3, very different in appearance. This bright orange stamp came into being, and the reason for that is that in 1893, when the Columbian issue came out, it was the first U.S. stamp other than special delivery to use this commemorative format, and it was believed that postal workers would confuse the E2 or the E1 with the Columbian because they were both the same color. So the special delivery stamp was printed in orange. Now, there's no record that this caused any confusion, but that's the reason why E3 is printed in orange. And here's just what I thought was an interesting example. Here's E3 on a souvenir cover from the actual Columbian Exposition in October of 1893. Again, it's just interesting to me because, this is why it was printed in orange. Now, this stamp was discontinued, shortly after its release, but it was used obviously for several more years. It was also believed that this particular color showed, cancellations quite prominently, though that's just, a belief. There's no written proof that that's why it was printed in orange. Now, this is something I find very, very interesting. You talk about the bureaucracy and try to speed up the mails. The Boston Post Office developed something which is called the Boston Clock Receiving Mark. And what it is if you look at that larger image on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a mark has been affixed to an incoming letter with a mechanical device that advanced with time. So this one, arrived at about 10 after 7 in the morning. You see AM, clerk number 25683 brought it in, and it also has the date at the bottom, December 23rd, 1893. So by using the Boston clock, it was believed that it would expedite mail delivery, only because the mail was able to be processed at the site a little bit more quickly. I've been looking for these covers. I own a couple of them, and I'm trying to find a little bit more about the history of it, because I just find that, again, how information technology delivery becomes critically important, and they're looking for, and I say the post office is looking for ways to expedite that delivery capability. Now, E4, the next special delivery stamp, was the first one to be printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Now, what the Bureau of Engraving and Printing did was they altered the die from E2, but the way they did it was, and you have to look very carefully, underneath the word 10 cents, there's a line there, that highlights, the fact that this is in fact the E4 stamp. This is one of the only ways you can really tell that this is an E4 versus an E2, but it's a prominent mark, and it's easily identified once you know it's there. Now, again, here's another, I found an interesting showy cover with an E4 on it. But again, this particular letter was not delivered because it arrived at the office at 8:20 p.m. and the office was closed. It's important to note that imperfects of the E4 exist. It even has a Scott's number, but it's not widely believed that this was actually something the Bureau of Engraving and Printing endorsed and actually put out. It's actually believed that these are forged. So every now and then I'll see some reference to an E4 imperfect, but again, it's widely believed that these are forged. Now the E5 comes along. It's the same die as the E4, but it's printed in perf 12 double-lined, watermark paper. So that's what makes it distinct. But it also was used because being issued in 1895, it was used right after the United States engaged in the Spanish-American War for overprints that were used in some of the acquired territories, such as Cuba, as well as in the Philippines. So it was used. This is where the overprints occurred for special delivery. And in fact, there is a valid E5 imperforate, that exists. But what the history of it's interesting because this was a special printing that was done for a particular person, G.E. Jones, who had done some work for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and it was done for him sort of as a gift, but it does exist. This particular imperforate block went up for sale about 10 years ago for several $1,000s. The running messenger sort of came to a logical conclusion, if you will. The post office department wanted to show something about faster delivery using some of the contemporary practices for delivery. So the bicycle messenger stamp was introduced in 1902. Its history is interesting because the Bureau of Engraving and Printing artist, R. Ostrander Smith, when he got the commission to do it, he went into the studio and took several pictures of himself riding a bicycle so we could get the design correct. And it's pretty, you know, for special delivery, it's kind of a famous picture. And, you know, and here's his first, you know, wash drawing, as it was called, his draft, if you will, of what the stamp would look like, again, with him as the model. Now, here's an example of the E6 going from Boston to Eastport, Maine. You know, I mentioned earlier about the importance of the railway mail service and the railway post office. And, you know, you're going to see that a lot of the marks, and I'll show you an example of this momentarily, a lot of marks exist that show the RPO stamp on it, as you'd expect. In 1902, the Postal Law Act introduced this mark called fee claimed by office of first delivery. And this, again, was another way to indicate that the receiving post office, you know, would receive the 10-cent fee, if you will, for delivering the special delivery letter. So again, it was really important to really capture who was going to be the recipient of the funds, if you will, associated with that special delivery. So this is an example of it. You see it on this particular cover. In 1907, the Postal Law Act stated that special delivery didn't require a special delivery stamp. And in this example from 1947, at the time, the rate of 13 cents was affixed with the stamps that you see on the cover, and it was stamped that said special delivery paid because it in fact was a special delivery envelope letter. Now, E7 is very different, if you will. First of all, it is a different size. It's not the commemorative size. And it was decided by the postmaster at the time that it was time for a new design. And instead of having someone from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing responsible for the design, it was actually, if you will, outsourced to a New York architect named Whitney Warren. And you know, his design sort of exemplifying speed and all of that, speed of messaging, you know, built on the theme of Mercury, you know, from Roman mythology. But the stamp became widely known as the Merry Widow because in that period, there was a popular operetta at the time, where one of the characters in the opera wore a straw hat, and the, you know, Mercury's helmet that's on the stamp, you know, reminded people of that, and therefore it became widely known as the Merry Widow. And you know, the designer of the stamp, Whitney, you know, he was doing the design, and he says, this looks about right. And, you know, that's an example of one of his early, you know, drawings of the stamp. And if you've ever seen, you know, the book 100 Greatest American Stamps, you'll see that this stamp is considered one of the most beautiful stamps in all of philately in the United States, at least by the people who wrote that book. Now, it's interesting that while he thought it was about right, in fact, he had put in the design, instead of 10 cents with the cent symbol, he put the word CTS. And that was changed before it went into production because it was an uncommon abbreviation for 10 cents. And so it was changed to, as you can see in the green version of the stamp on the left, the traditional cent symbol. Now, here's an example of E7 on cover. Again, as I mentioned, a lot of special delivery of mail in general was transferred through the railway post office. And again, you can just see, as in the previous example, which I didn't point out, this particular special delivery letter was carried in the railway post office and stamped along the way. This stamp was discontinued, a few months, about a half year after it came into being, because the new postmaster general at the time just decided that it wasn't appropriate or didn't like it or whatever, and it quickly died out. Now, the subsequent messenger stamps, which they went back to between E8, 9, 10, and 11, were all printed in different styles, either flatbed, primarily, I shouldn't say, they were flatbed printed with different perforations, different watermarking, different colors and the like. Just to note that all of these stamps, collectors find it very difficult to distinguish them, especially when they're on cover, because sometimes the only way to do that is by looking at the perforations. But this collection of 4 stamps carried the post office through several years, certainly during World War I. Now, in 1922, another design was commissioned, and again, to sort of exemplify speed of delivery, the mechanization of the post office, the third assistant postmaster general at the time, W. Irving Glover, ordered this new design highlighting the mechanization of the post office. And what you see here is the design of the stamp. It's based on one of these 2 motorcycles, and is an ongoing debate as to which one it is. And as late as July 2000, articles were still written about it as to which stamp was really the design of this particular stamp. And here's an interesting fact that this person, Glover, he formalized the first day process using E12 as the stamp that the first time a first day of issue event occurred in Washington, D.C. And that's an example of one of those first day covers. Now he's I think a very interesting person. He was a assistant postmaster general. He was very active in the modernization of the post office. And as we just talked about, focusing on the first day of issue events. It's also interesting that he eventually took over responsibility for airmail, and in his obituary he was claimed to have said, the business is not content with mail creeping along on the iron horse. So again, some forward-looking people in the post office department at the time, really trying to push the delivery of service along. E13 came along in 1925. And this was at the time when postal rates started to change. And as you can imagine, postal rates changed because it was, there was more and more expense built into the delivery of the mail. And special delivery was also, a victim of increased rates during this period. So the next design was the delivery truck, and the photograph that you see was used as the basis of the design for the E14 stamp in 1925, and then obviously later on another version of it came out using a different printing process. But I just find this amazing that the photograph that we use is fairly accurately represented in the designer's stamp as shown there. Now, as I just mentioned, the Postal Rate Act of 1925, instituted 2 rates for parcel post, of which special delivery was factored in. So it was 15 cents for packages over 2 pounds but under 10, as was shown in the previous stamp on the previous slide. And then for any packages over 10 pounds, a 20-cent fee was assigned to that package. It was also during this time that special delivery between countries started, between the United States and Canada. Now, the rate of this stamp, the 20 cent, you typically don't see it on a cover because they were typically used for packages, and they were primarily on wrappers, which were usually not saved. But here's an example of a tag where for $1.56, some mushrooms were shipped from Pennsylvania to Palm Beach, Florida, and the 20 cent special delivery fee was paid to make sure that the mushrooms would get there on time. E15 and 16, subsequent versions of the motorcycle version of the stamp were issued in 1927, 1931, again, reflecting different printing techniques and different colors, if you will. Now, and also during this time, there were new rates associated with both letters as well as packages. Again, as time marches on, as we all know, cost goes up, and the expectation is that the consumer is going to absorb that cost. Now, it's also interesting, right around this time, the Post Office Department in 1939 defined an envelope especially for special delivery. Much like the barber pole that you see in airmail covers, they also defined a cover using these half circles of yellow and green to denote that it was a special delivery envelope. But it didn't really catch on, and there are very few examples of it. I just find it an interesting sort of historical footnote. Now, airmail special delivery was also a postal service that people had access to. And in 1934 and 36, these two particular airmail special delivery stamps, CE 1 and 2, were released. Now, the design of this, the seal of the United States was suggested by, Franklin Roosevelt. And, as we all know, Franklin Roosevelt was, famous stamp collector. It's also interesting to note that the fee for airmail special delivery was 16 cents. So it was 6 cents for paid airmail plus 10 cents for paid special delivery rate. Now, this did cause some confusion, and it was fairly common to see someone send a letter with some franking on it, as well as the airmail special delivery stamp. And in this case, the 2 cent stamp is not required in order for the special delivery letter to be mailed. Also, I'm sure everybody is familiar with Farley's Follies, a set of imperforates that were put together for the president that eventually were released to the public, if you know the story. And again, this particular design was released as an imperforate as part of that release. Now, here's the special delivery bonus round, if you will. So the question might be, are there any other airmail special delivery stamps? Well, as it turns out, C3 and C2 were in fact airmail special delivery stamps, because when airmail service started, the Postmaster General at the time stated that for the 24-cent fee in the case of C3, 10 cents of it would be for special delivery service. So the airmail rate being 14 cents and special delivery being 10 cents. When the rate changed later in 1918, same thing was true for C2, 6 cents for the airmail rate, 10 cents for special delivery. But this phenomenon, if you will, was very short-lived. When the Post Office Department took over airmail service and the rate was set to 6 cents, and therefore the issue of C1 came about, setting the postal rate at 6 cents, and you would have to affix a special delivery rate if you wanted your airmail to be delivered special. So here's an example of a cover from the first week of airmail service, where in fact is not only an airmail version of the stamp, but special delivery. Again, as we're moving on in time, approaching the 1940s, additional stamps were released at increased rates. And as you can see from the rate table, rates continue to go up. Not a surprise. We see that today with postal rates, but back then there was an ever increasing around special delivery rates, maybe not at the same rate as we see today, but nonetheless, they continue to rise. And it was also during this time that any messengers were no longer, if you will, free to do that role, or contractors, however you want to describe it. Special delivery messengers became employees of the post office department. Now, the final four, special delivery continued, moving into the 1950s, E20 and E21, again at increased rates. And then finally, the last two stamps in 1969 and 1971, again at higher rates, became the last two stamps that were issued for special delivery service. Now, how does the end of special delivery come about? Kind of reverting back to the beginning of the discussion around the information environment, it was radically different in the 1990s compared to what it was when special delivery started. The notion of I need it overnight became very important. So recall that special delivery was part of the mail stream, so it didn't get there as fast as people wanted. And services such as United States Postal Service Express Mail and private services such as Federal Express came into being. So the notion of I want it overnight took prominence in people's mind, and therefore they're intolerant of it not being delivered in that kind of a period of time. So Express Mail was introduced as an experimental service in 71, and it became permanent in 77. And if you take a look at the difference between postal rates between special delivery and express mail, while there is a difference, express mail was much more reliable. It was faster. It might cost more, but access was available to all people. And again, recall that special delivery used the mail stream. So again, you couldn't speed it up any faster than you could speed up normal mail. In services such as express mail and FedEx, they used an end-to-end service, which basically was anything that was delivered with express mail or Federal Express, end-to-end was handled all the way through in terms of treating that delivery as important. So in fact, they could become much more predictable and been able to deliver mail that was of a special nature overnight. So it was terminated on June 7th, 1997. Again, a victim, if you will, of the evolving information environment where its competition was able to beat it on cost, reliability, time of delivery. And as we know at the time, the post office had become a private entity, and it was a victim of cost cutting. And the image on the left was snapped by somebody in a post office in Nebraska in 2007. Special delivery slot still there, but it had gone away 10 years earlier. So that's what I had. Appreciate your attention. Thank you.